Alrighty, well, welcome everybody to our first Zoom session for the Cherry Blossom Festival Shawl. I'm really excited to be doing this one because it was a fun shawl to design, and it is our third annual summer shawl knit along. So it's been fun to do these every single year, and they're all themed off of vacations. The first one was the summer road trip shawl, and it was all about knitting on the road. The second one was the staycation shawl, and it was about staying in your backyard and having some lovely, fun knitting time to yourself at home. And this one is about going to beautiful spring and summer festivals where you've got lots and lots of flowers and a picnic out on the lawn as well. So that was my inspiration for this particular shawl. And all of the motifs and everything that I've put into it are tied into that idea of beautiful summer floral experiences. So I know for myself, I really enjoy going out to all the way to Vancouver Island and the Bouchard Gardens and having a picnic on the lawn there. And they'll often do all sorts of like lovely light shows and things at night. And of course, I was lucky enough to go with Atelier Nekazuki last year to Japan, and they had a lot of lantern festivals and so on throughout the year. Now, we weren't there for the cherry blossoms themselves, but there were still amazing floral displays, a lot of azaleas, for example. So that's what the shawl is inspired by, and I hope that as you knit it, you get a chance to experience some lovely floral experiences too. So one of the things that I wanted to do was just take you on a little tour of how the shawl is designed, because I know myself when I'm knitting a shawl that I find the inspiration really interesting. So where did the designer come up with things? And then the other thing that I find helpful is having an understanding of how it's constructed. So sometimes you buy a shawl pattern and the shawl is really pretty, and I'm just going to tip this down a little bit more so you can see more of what I'm doing as I wave it about. Anyway, the shawl is really pretty, but you're not actually sure how it's shaped. So the first thing I wanted to explain is that this is a triangular shawl, and so it has an increase on the side of a center spine, and it has increases on each edge. Now, this particular triangle shape is interesting because it's not as deep, but it's much, much wider. And the whole reason for this shape, and the reason I chose it, is because it doesn't go a super long ways down your back, and you've got more wings on the side, which makes it more wearable and more stylable. So you've got a lot of options in terms of what you're going to do when you're wearing the shawl. And I just realized I never spotlighted myself, so maybe we'll fix that. What will happen with some of these things is that Zoom will just record the active speaker here. So right now we're okay, but for the people watching the recording, we want to make sure they see everything. So with the shawl, the increases are going to happen on every single row. So it increases quite fast. And like I say, they're going to happen on each edge and on the center. So there is a center stitch, and you can see that nice little spine on there. And so there's an increase on each side of those. Some shawls will only increase every second row. Some will increase every fourth row. This one increases every single row. So it's got quite a fast rate of increase. So to make up for the fact that you end up with rows with quite a few stitches quite quickly, one of the things that I did was to put a stitch pattern into it for you that gives you lots and lots of knitting and a little less purling. So in the main ridge pattern that you see there, there's only one row out of every four that's purled for those of us who are not so big a fan of purling. I myself actually like purling, but I knit a slightly different way from a lot of people. So my style is very purling friendly. Anyway, so having introduced the shape of the shawl and given you a little bit of the idea about where it came from, what I'm going to do today for you is we're going to do lots of tips and tricks for knitting the shawl and choosing yarn and working with colors for the first, I would say, third of the shawl. And that's going to take you all the way through those first two lace panels and these lovely little blossom bud sections. So we'll give you also lots and lots of information there. If you have any questions throughout the Zoom, please feel free to either put them into the chat or raise your hand. Wendy is here with us. She's going to let me know if I'm missing any sort of questions or anything like that so that I can answer them for you. And I do encourage you to ask as much as you want. Feel free to break in and comment, whatever is comfortable for you, because we are here to do things together, sense of community, knit along. And then also there might be something that I haven't thought of that you really need to know. And there is no, in my opinion, stupid question. They are always smart, and there will always be somebody else who wants to know the answer to the very same thing. So that's one of the things that's really important, is to make sure you ask any questions that come to your mind and get all the help that you possibly can. So now, next thing is the choice of yarn. If you bought a shawl kit, you will have either bought the one that has a blend of Little Nettle and Socknado. Socknado is our merino nylon sock yarn, and it's a little bit fluffier than the Little Nettle, or you will have bought the Socknado kit itself. In both cases, you'll be able to get the correct gauge for the shawl. And the one thing that I want to warn you is, regardless of what yarn you're using, whether it's from the kits or whether it's stash yarn, just watch out for the yarn that you assign to the dark color in this shawl, because this shawl uses most of that yarn. As I recall, I only had about 8 grams of the skein of yarn left. So there is actually information at the beginning of the pattern that says, weigh your yarn when you get to the final border on this shawl. And if you have less than 35 grams, you can just get a different color and knit the border on with that. So I just want to warn you about, most of the time I build a big margin into my shawls, like 10 or 15%, so that if you're a little off gauge, who cares? And let me tell you, I never knit to gauge. I don't even bother trying with shawls, and that's how I end up with Stephen West shawls that are 9 feet across. So most designers will build a margin in, but they'll warn you when there's less of a margin, and the dark color in this shawl has less of a margin. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. So it is either, if you want to just use the one color, stay to gauge, or you can always substitute a different color in on the border. So that's too, if you just really like playing with colors, and if you're stash busting, for example, you could grab some yarn where you've got at least 40 grams left and knit your border on with another color yet. So it's a very customizable shawl in that way. You can play with colors in this, you can stay with what we have, or you can really experiment and have fun. The choice of Little Nettle is because this is a summer shawl, and one of the neat things about nettle fibers is that they're very temperature regulating. So this is a nice summer shawl that you can wear. It's a cool morning, you put it on, you're wearing it, and suddenly it gets warm, and in Calgary you never know what's going to happen. Well, the nettle will keep you cool as well, so it's very good at heat transference. And if you're like me and have what I so picturesquely call a personal climate zone, it's also really nice as well, because it will keep you at a more steady temperature. So when, all of a sudden it goes up 10 degrees Celsius in my area, this is going to make me quite comfortable. And in fact, I was actually prone to using one of these nettle shawls during a lot of the Zooms I did during the pandemic, because the room I was doing them from was quite warm. And so I would actually put a shawl on to do the Zoom, because it actually kept me a lot more comfortable than I was without it. So that was just a fun little thing about this, is that this is a great summer yarn because it'll keep you cozy. The Socknado was 2 reasons. One, you're able to get away with mini skeins, which reduces the overall amount of yarn that you have to use in the shawl, because you can use the minis for the colors. And then the other thing is that Socknado is just a little bit floofier than the Little Nettle. So for the flowers, it stood out a little more, and I thought that was kind of fun. So it gave you slight additional squish in the flowers of the shawl. So I always like to think about textures as well as color patterns and so on. And so those bands with the Socknado have that extra little squish, like a soft flower blossom. I see that we had one question in the chat so far, which is, what is the shawl beside me? That is my Roman Villa shawl, which I can never resist showing off. I like to have something in my studio just to keep me, looking at a knit piece and inspired. And so that's the one that's in here this week. So in terms of yarn, like I say, you can substitute from stash. So if you're one of the people who's showing the KAL and you're working with stash, that is absolutely no problem. I do not require people to use our yarn for our knit-alongs, because I know we all have our own stash, and I don't require you to buy the kit itself if you've got other Ancient Arts yarn. So you can work with stash and you can substitute colors. The only thing you'll want to watch out for with substituting colors is to make sure that you've got contrast for those little blossom bud bands. So that means some light and some dark, which gives you that ability to see those stitches better. And then the same thing for the big blossom flowers. They will stand out better if you've got contrast. It doesn't have to be as stark and sharp as this particular version of the shawl. It can be a little bit softer if you want, and there's no harm about that. You'll have a very nice result even so. Now you'll notice that there's a band of lace here that uses a variegated yarn, and I actually broke a rule about lace there. So that's another thing, is that if you wanted to use a really variegated yarn, you're going to have an issue in that it's going to hide some of the patterning in the shawl. I broke the rule on this particular band because this band is all about hanging lanterns from the trees for a picnic in the evening. And so the lanterns are kind of hidden among those leaves. So this is a colorway called Get Off My Lawn. And the interesting thing about this colorway is it does have the ability to do a little bit of pooling. So the color will concentrate in certain areas. So you can see on the edges of the shawl, the little motifs there are much more visible than they are where there's more of the colors stacked up. They disappear a bit. So a very strongly patterning yarn will hide motifs. And like I say, as a designer, I've made the decision to do a little bit of hiding my motif in that band on this particular version of the shawl, because it just made me smile at the idea of the lanterns hiding among the leaves of the trees. So that's what the little motifs in there are intended to be, is they're intended to be lanterns hanging in the trees where you're going to view your cherry blossoms, and you're either walking along those avenues of trees or you're having a nice picnic underneath them. But if you want them to stand out more noticeably, then you would choose a solid color for the lace bands in order for them to show. So this particular first band here, you see the motifs show very nicely, and the reason for that is that they are in a very solid color. So this is a nice little delicate pink for delicate pink cherry blossoms, and you have rosettes of blossoms there that show nicely because it's not variegated. It's totally up to you as to whether or not you want to use a variegated yarn. It's just something to be aware of, that it does change how lace can show based on whether or not your yarn is patterning or not. So some of the kits that we've set up, if you haven't got one yet and are still planning on it, will have solid colors there. And then there's some that will have a delicate little bit of speckle or variation for those who want a little bit more of that. In terms of substituting, if you are substituting, then you're going to need, for the blossom colors and the lace, 40 grams of each of those two colors. So if you're diving into your stash, you would be able to do that as long as you have either 2 mini skeins or at least 40 grams for them. There will be a little bit of yarn left over from them, so you have, again, the ability to be a little bit of off gauge. Always, it doesn't matter how many gauge swatches I knit, by the way, I will go off gauge. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. I will always have a shawl that's bigger than it's supposed to be. It's very nice to design them because then it actually comes out at your size. Anyway, so you will have a little bit of a margin on those, so don't get worried about it if you're a little bit off. The only one, like I said earlier, is the dark one. So now, some things to walk through on the pattern, and then what we're going to do is we're going to pause and do a prize giveaway, because one of the things I love about KALs is giving away prizes, and that's always very fun. Just gonna have a sip of tea here. It's pollen season, and outside the studio, we have a lot of big lilac bushes, and they're starting to bloom, and it's absolutely gorgeous, but I do get a little bit hoarse when that starts to happen. So walking through the pattern, there's a few things to take note of. And like I've mentioned already, one of them is that the gauge in this shawl is important in terms of the main color dark. So with that one, again, there is information on page 2 about how much yarn you're going to need for your border. And if you get to the point where you're at the border and you're worried, weigh your yarn with a scale. And you can get like a little cheap kitchen scale. Amazon has them for anywhere between 20 to, like, you can get a really fancy one for $30. And they're super helpful. Clearly, I like my new scale. Super helpful because you can weigh the yarn and get an estimate of how much you've got left without having to try and measure it somehow, which is a pain. So you'll want to make sure you have enough for that border because it is fairly yarn intensive. It's a fun border because I like to work with historical things. And so the border is actually adapted from a 19th century lace that's a British lace. So it's kind of fun, and it's going to give you a chance to do some things that we don't see so much in modern knitting, which is different ways of doing knit stitches. So we will get to those, and I will definitely be demonstrating it. The other thing I'm going to do is, for a couple of the parts of this shawl, we're going to record a few short videos and put them up on YouTube for you to watch, so you don't have to go through an entire Zoom to refresh yourself on how to work the large blossoms or the border stitches, because there's some interesting things there. So the neat little motifs that we have on there do something that, again, some modern knitters might not be familiar with. Sort of the things that I learned when I learned to knit. My mother basically threw me into it and said, here's how to cast on, here's how to knit some stuff, like make knit stitches and purl stitches. Now fly, be free. And so if I was going to refer to books 50 some years ago, I had to refer to the books in the family, and well, some of those were almost 100 years old. So I have some really different ideas about knitting stitches than people who have learned via YouTube. Anyway, next part of page 2 that I just want to draw your attention to is that there are some notes. So the notes here on the bottom part of the page are useful little things for you to pay attention to. So one of them talks about the shawl is worked from the top down with increases on both edges and at the center. So I want you to remember that every time that you're on an edge, whether it's the right edge or the left edge, whether it's a right side row or a wrong side row, you will have an increase of some kind, because it's easy to forget that. And then all of a sudden there's an issue with your stitches and what's going on. Now, one thing that I am going to give you permission with this shawl is if you forget an increase on the border, don't rip all the way back, fudge it, and do a knit front and back into a stitch to add an extra stitch, and continue on your happy way. No one will ever know. I will never tell. It will be our secret, and it means you don't have to rip back a really long row, because that is super frustrating. And wherever you find out that you have made this little boo-boo, you can throw a knit front back in right before you need that stitch, and no one will know. In fact, I have used this in samples, and I will admit to you now, one of them is in the staycation shawl from last year, where somebody who looks a lot like me missed one border increase. So I just literally did that little trick. The shawl looks perfect, and even I now can't find where it was. I know what section it's in, where it is, I have no idea. So that's just a little tip, because we're not always used to putting those increases in on every single edge, every single row, and it's super easy to forget one, especially if you have an evil cat who comes along and grabs your ball of yarn and runs for it. That's when you will forget every single time. The next part here is that it talks about that we want to allow the edge stitches to be loose, and I'm going to give you a couple of tricks on that if you tend to be a tight knitter. And then it reminds you that they are slipped. Now, one of the things that's really intriguing about slipping stitches on the edge of the shawl is that you can make them lie really smooth, or you can end up with weird lumpy bits. So I have a little note there that says to you, if the last stitch on the previous row was knit, then you're going to slip the yarn purlwise with the yarn in front, the stitch rather, with the yarn in front. It will never leave a lump on the edge of your shawl if you do that. So you would slip the stitch with the yarn in front, and then put the yarn between the two needles, and that will then give you that smooth edge. If the last stitch was purled, then you will slip the next stitch, so on the beginning of the next row, with the yarn in back. And again, you don't get any crossing over. So for years and years and years, when I would be slipping those stitches, I don't understand why I'm getting these weird little lumps at times. And then I finally sat down and figured out the geometry and went, it's all about what was the last stitch at the end of the previous row. How has it worked? So that's just a little note. Everywhere in the pattern, it will tell you what to do. But again, if you're like me and tend to put the pattern down when you're working your ridge section, you pick it back up, you don't feel like going and finding the pattern again. Just remember, if the last stitch was purled, then you slip with the yarn in back. If the last stitch was knit, then you slip with the yarn in front. And that note is there to remind you, because I find that super helpful. The other thing about the notes that I mentioned in here is that when you get to the large blossoms, you can use your knitting needle to pull loops of yarn through to create the blossom flower. So what happens first is that section is knit and eyelets are formed with yarn overs and knit two togethers. And you can use a knitting needle to pull a yarn through, but it will give you a lot of gray hair if you don't already have enough of it. And I highly recommend using a crochet hook instead. So in Zoom 2, we will cover how to do that. And I will attempt to demonstrate with a knitting needle as well if you don't want to purchase a crochet hook or don't already own one. But I do say that it is much, 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 much easier to do with a crochet hook. So the third thing that I wanted to draw your attention to in the pattern is that sometimes stitch patterns will be separate from the rest of the pattern if they're constantly referred to. So the top of page 3 has your 4 rows of how to work your ridge stitches. So everywhere that it refers to ridge stitches in the pattern, you'll go back here to get the 4-row repeat to do them. So this is a typical thing that'll happen in knitting patterns to reduce the number of pages. But again, not everybody will have run into that. And I always like to point it out because it's super annoying when you're going along and going, where are these rows? I cannot find these rows, because sometimes they're at the beginning, sometimes they're at the end, and that is frustrating. So that is where they are living in the pattern, is on the top left of page 3. And then, of course, we have various different definitions and abbreviations. There are 3 different ways to add stitches in this shawl. So that's the other thing that I will bring your attention to is in the abbreviations, it doesn't just define the abbreviation, it tells you how to make the stitch as well. So there is a make one left, and a make one right. And I will demonstrate those for you today, but I also wanted to draw your attention to the instruction being there. So if you're not sure how to do it, that will tell you. With plain old make one, it's kind of interesting in patterns because make one, there's all sorts of different ways that people might do it. You might pick up the bar between the stitches, you might knit front and back, you might do a backwards loop, cast on stitch. There's all sorts of things that you can do. So I've defined it for you there. And the one that we are going to use where it only says make one, which is in one of the laces, is done with a backwards loop cast on. So a very easy thing to do, but I just wanted you to be aware of how it's done there. If you pick the bar up in that particular lace, then it actually gives you a twisted stitch and it's quite noticeable. Doing a make one via a backwards loop cast on stitch means that the lace stays nice and smooth and there's no weird lumpy bumpies or strange angled stitches to draw the eye away from the shapes that are in the lace. So another little useful thing there. There is special techniques on how to do some of the stitches later on page 4. So how to catch the strands with a crochet hook. There's a nice long description there, but again, we will do some video demonstrations for you because I know sometimes it's a lot easier to figure it out by seeing someone do it as opposed to reading it. And then there is a stitch that a lot of modern knitters will not have run into, and it's called a knit one elongated wrapping yarn thrice. Wow, that's quite a mouthful, isn't it? So again, we'll be demonstrating those, and that's used in the border. What it does is it gives you a nice long knit stitch without having to do things like do a yarn over that's wrapped multiple times, drop it, and then pull it into the knit stitch. So it's a nifty little way to combine a yarn over and a knit stitch at the same time, and it was used a lot in the olden days when I learned to knit, and you see it a lot less now. So it's a fun way to do some interesting things with extending knit stitches. So those are the main things that I wanted to draw your attention to and how the pattern is laid out. And now what I think we'll do is we'll have Wendy draw our first prize for our KAL, and that will be a $50 gift certificate. Good for anything on our website or in store. And so I am just going to move the spotlight to Wendy.
Hello, everybody. So what I did was I used a random number generator and I got the number 5 and I counted the people that are guests in our Zoom. And the 5th guest on my gallery is a lady named Stephanie Scott.
Ah.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So what we are going to have you do is email Wendy, and her email is sales@ancientartsfiber.com. She's going to put that into the chat for you, and then she will set up your gift certificate for you. We don't ever in Zooms or anywhere else, like giveaways online, ever ask you to give any personal information because in this day and age, it is not a wise choice. But you contact us, we'll set you all up and get you going with your gift certificate.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right.
Congratulations.
Yeah. I am going to now spotlight my camera here with my nice crumpled up shawl because I'm going to give you some demonstrations of some things that you're going to do in the shawl. Now, one of the very first things that we're going to do in this shawl, and I did not label it as such in the pattern because I know some people will look at it and go, oh dear God, I cannot do that. It is too horrible for words, and run screaming into the distance. And that is, it starts with a garter stitch tab. Do not let garter stitch tabs scare you. They are not awful, and I'm going to show you a couple of things that I do with them that make them really easy. One of the reasons that you start with a garter stitch tab is that it gives you a nice foundation to build off of with your shawl. Come on, yarn. But there's a little trick to make them a lot less horrible, and that's what I'm going to show you today. And the little trick involves removable stitch markers. So our friends, the removable stitch marker, make a garter stitch tab a lot less horrible. Because the thing about garter stitch tabs is you've done this thing, you've made this little tiny piece of garter stitch, and then how on earth do I manage to pick up the stitches? Where do I pick them up? And how do I get them on that cast on edge? Because that is sometimes less than enjoyable. So what I'm going to do is show you the garter stitch tab for this shawl, and then show you my sneaky little trick for how we deal with those nasty little edge stitches and picking up. So the first thing that I always do is a slip knot, and then I'm going to cast on a massive 2 stitches for this particular shawl. So we have cast on 2 stitches. Now, the secret of the universe for garter stitch tabs that makes them so much easier later on is to stop at this point and put a locking stitch marker into each one of the cast on stitches. If this garter tab began with 4 or 5 or 6, I would do it with every single one of them. So I'm going to just put a locking stitch marker into each one of these. And what this is going to do is allow you to find those cast on stitches later when you need to pick them up and knit into them. You'll be able to find them much more easily than you would have otherwise. So all of a sudden, something that is horrible and nasty, and how do I find those stitches to put my pickup stitches into them, will be much, much easier. Garter stitch tabs will have a certain number of rows knit, and that's going to form garter ridges. And what those garter ridges are going to do is give you a place to pick up as well. So this one has you knit 6 rows. So you get to watch me knit 6 teeny tiny rows. And I always forget how many I knit, so I will literally chant to myself as I do them, 1, 2, and so on, so that I count them as I go. So this one is row 2. And you'll let me know, Wendy, if we're having any troubles in seeing what I'm doing. That's 3.
Well, you're dead center and in focus.
Yay. I'm using a new camera today, and it's always interesting to see how they behave. 4. And I am using a DK yarn here to demonstrate with, but the whole thing works exactly the same, whether it's DK or fingering. Now I've lost count. So if you lose count, what you do is stretch your work out and count the number of ridges. And you can see that I have 3 ridges here, which means I was actually just finishing my 6th row. So now what it will tell you to do is to turn your work and pick up along the edge. So the garter bumps themselves are a great place to pick up. So you see those 3 bumps along there? They are where you're going to grab a loop and pick your stitch up. So you can grab the one that's on the edge, which is usually the easiest one to get your needle into, or you could actually go right through it. Does it make a bit of difference? No. With your garter tab, you'll never notice the difference, and I'm going to do both of them for you so that you can see that later. So on my next little ridge, I'm going to pick up this one, which is that outside little loop. Try and get my fingers away from it so you can see me. See, you can't really tell. So with the garter bumps, pick up along the edge, pick up whatever you can get your needle into, and don't worry about it too much because it's not going to make any difference later on. Now, at this point, we would turn our work 90 degrees again and pick up in the cast on edge. And this is where our stitch markers become wonderful, glorious things because you can identify what those stitches are at this point. Otherwise, you've got this higgledy-piggledy kind of awkward edge and you don't really know where those stitches are and where should I pick up and how do I even get them loose enough to do that. Well, this is where your locking stitch markers come in. Makes it really easy. Of course, I split the yarn there, but there we go. 1, and then pull on the other one. 2, and then you've got all of your pickup done and you can remove your stitch markers. So that is the secret of the universe for garter tabs. Do we have any questions about those? Do you want to see anything again? Because I know for some of us, garter tabs are like horrible and awful and confusing and evil and bad, but with that little trick with your bulb pins, that just makes such a difference. So I don't mind garter stitch tabs anymore at all. However, if I forget to put the pins in at the beginning, I will immediately rip the whole thing out when I get to this point because they can be so unpleasant otherwise. But they do give you a nice firm little edge to start along with here. And that's a lot of the reasons why designers will choose to go with them. They also tend to, if you get them the right length for the shawl, not give you that nasty, stupid hump that you get with some versions. And personally, I don't like the hump in a shawl. So that's one of the reasons why I chose a garter tab for this one. Okay, just checking the chat to see if we have any questions in here. Yeah, some of us will find that garter tabs are not a big deal, but it's always useful to find another little trick that people will use. And I know that it's always nice when a designer says to you, you know, you don't have to have a perfect garter tab and no one will ever know. Sometimes when you're working with a needle that isn't as sharp, for example, and you're trying to pick up along that little bump, basically wherever you can get that needle in, it's going to come out just fine because you will not know any different. So that's the garter tab here. The next thing that I was going to show you, and I am just going to check my little list of things I wanted to demonstrate, is how to do a make one right and a make one left. Not everybody will have done a make one right or a make one left, and so it's nice to see them demonstrated. And I want to give you a little way to remember them. I'm just going to knit a straight row here, and then we will do that. There's a nice little trick to remember which direction without having to look it up every single time. Okay, I'm just going to purl one row so that we can see these clearly. What the heck was that? Oh goodness, some people, some days, talking to my hands here, being rascals. Okay, and we have a nice clean edge where you'll be able to see the bars properly. So I'm just going to do make ones wherever in this row. Now, we're going to do a make one right, and make one left and make one right will lean in different directions. So they're quite often used along the spine, and what they will do is they will angle the stitches in a particular direction. A make one right will angle a stitch off to the right, a make one left will angle a stitch off to the left. But how do you remember how to do them? A make one right, you're going to pick the yarn up, the bar in between the stitches, so you can see this bar right there. And I'll give you a couple of different angles. You're going to pick it up from the back. And what you have to do when you put your needle in to knit that stitch is that you have to put it in so that the tip is pointing to the right. Cool, huh? So in order to make a knit one right, the tip of the needle points to the right. And now you're going to have a stitch that leans right. That's an increase. To do a make one left, you're going to put your needle tip in under the bar from the front. And when you put your needle in to knit that stitch, it points to the left. So this is how I remember which direction to do these. So if I'm doing a make one left, then what I have to do is point my needle to the right to do the actual knit stitch. A make one right, the needle tip has to go in pointing to the right. A make one left, the needle tip has to go in pointing to the left. Let's try picking that up the right way, correct way. So see how it points left. So this is a little trick that I use to remember which is which, and it makes it a lot less annoying than having to go and look it up every single time. So that was the way that I was able to memorize the make one right and the make one left. If you're picking up the bar and you've picked it up in the wrong direction, it makes it harder to do the stitch or too easy to do the stitch, depending on which direction you're trying to do this. And that's a giveaway again that, you know, there's a problem. Picking up the bar and knitting it in those ways twists the bar, which tightens it up underneath. And then, like I say, it causes the stitch to lean, to point. So how the stitch bar is twisted will affect how they look. So I'm just going to knit this row and then you'll be able to see these leans in different directions. So do we have any questions on that? Feel free to break in if you do. And then in the next row, I'm going to show you the make one that we use. So when we look in here, I think we need another row. Let's get a little bit more yarn here. We'll be able to see these leaning in different directions. And so the make one left and right will often be used on the edges of shawls to just have a nice even direction of stitches in the increases, but like I say, you'll really find them around the spine of a shawl, that center stitch, and they make the stitches flow out of them. So you can see my increases are pointed in different directions here. Because we've alternated them, it looks a little bit strange in there, but you can see that they're leaning in various different ways. And when we go to the spine of the shawl, it's really noticeable. So when we look at the spine of the shawl by using make one rights and make one lefts, let's turn this so that it's the direction as if we were knitting it. You see how the make one rights will flow off to the right and the make one lefts flow off to the left. If you chose to use a different increase, so if you did a knit front and back because you absolutely despise doing make one rights and make one lefts, there are no knitting police, and I will not come for you and say, oh, naughty person. So you can do the way that it's written to get the nice flow. If you do a knit front and back, no one will come and, you know, say, oh dear God, the horror of it all either. So I know that there are people who have very strong feelings on make one right and left. And so I am giving you permission to do whatever you are comfortable with on that spine. But that little trick about watching the direction that needle point goes really does help me to remember which way the stitches are pointing and thusly which direction I am doing. So make one right and left. All righty. Now the ridge stitch pattern is kind of interesting because you're going to be knitting 3 rows and just purling 1. So I just wanted to remind everybody that it's a nice, easy thing to do. And the purl row actually doesn't exactly fall where you might expect it in there. The purl row falls, and we'll go right back to this set of stitch instructions. The purl row falls at the very last one. So what that does is it creates a ridge because you get 1 garter ridge out of the rest of them. So just remember that when you're in this section, you're going to knit 3 rows and purl 1 row. That's how the ridges are formed. So this is a nice breathing space for you as opposed to when you're doing other more complex things. Now, the other thing that I wanted to do with this, and actually, you know what? Oh, no, that's what the other swatch is for. What we're going to do with this as well is now I'm going to show you the other make one that's used in the shawl. Why am I doing that to myself? Okay, so we're coming along and we're doing the things and we are happily told to make one. There's lots of different ways that you can do this, but the one that's used here is a backwards loop. If you're a continental knitter, you might need to do this slightly differently. An English knitter, what you're going to do is literally take the yarn, flip it off your finger and slip it on. It's just a half hitch. If you're a continental knitter and you've got the yarn in the other hand, you're just going to take it and put it on your forefinger and turn it again. And again, you get that half hitch. Both of those will work just fine to do your increase. And that increase sits nice and smoothly in the body of the knitting. It doesn't do any twisting. It's not really directional. And that's one of the reasons why it's in this particular shawl, is that it gives you an additional stitch without doing anything too weird in terms of a lean. So we'll just purl along so that you can see it later on. It's particularly nice for reverse stocking stitches, which is where it's hidden in this particular shawl, because it very much does not show. Okay, now when you get to them, this is the one thing about these make ones that are annoying, is that they're very loose. So you're just going to have to tease your needle tip in there, and it will all even out when you give the knitting a tug later on, but they tend to be really annoying backwards loop cast-ons. But when we look at the knitting later, you can see that there's no angling of the increase in there. So just to show you that again, it's just a nice little loop. And the reason why it's called backwards is because you need to have the loop twisted when it goes on so that it acts like a half hitch. If it goes on and it's not twisted, it's just a yarn over. So it has to be twisted to get the increase to work. And let's just check. Okay, we don't have any questions in our chat. Do we have any questions about the make one with a backwards loop cast on? If any of you are Stephen West fans, you'll notice that he uses that one quite a bit. And again, it's because it's not too disruptive to a stitch pattern. A knit front and back, you'll get what looks like a purl bump. And obviously make one rights, make one lefts, they use the bar and you'll get a twist in there, or you'll get a bit of a hole. So that's a really nice one that designers will use when they don't want to have anything that disrupts the flow of the fabric or catches the eye. So for this particular, yes.
We do have a question in the chat. Kim is asking that she is on the step up row 2. Where does she put the yarn over?
The what?
On the step up row 2, where does she put the yarn over?
I'm not sure what you mean by step up.
Okay. I'm not sure either. Maybe Kim, you can clarify to me, and then we'll ask again in a
Well,
couple of minutes.
why don't you just unmute and we'll chat about it right now? That would be really a great question.
Hi, I am on Chef Up Road 2 after using the broadcast shift. So I guess row 1, the knit one, knit front back, knit one, place a marker, knit one. So I am on the 11 stitches. So when you put your markers in, I don't know.
Can you let me know which page that is? Oh, setup. I'm being dumb. Okay, so I have an audio processing disorder and I will sometimes misunderstand words. And so my brain was saying something completely different. So setup row. And so which one was that for? Because there's setup rows in a few places.
Row 2.
Yes, which page?
That'll be page 5.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so setup row 2. Okay, so we've done our garter tab. Then what we're going to do is the first row, we are doing some increases there, and we actually will use a knit front and back in that row, and that gives us 9 stitches once we've got our garter tab done. Then after that, we're doing a slip 1 with the yarn in front, a yarn over, and a purl to last stitch, slipping the markers that you put in the first row, the yarn overs and the purls. So that's actually a really great question, is how are we doing those yarn overs? So we have knit the last stitch, which means that when we slip this one, we're going to slip the first stitch of a wrong side row with the yarn at the front of the needle, put it between the needles, but then we have to do a yarn over. There's 2 different ways that you can do a yarn over. One is to bring it over the needle, the top of the needle, and just purl. So it makes a very short yarn over. The other way is to, instead of putting the yarn between the needles as one would to get into the working position, is bring it over the top of the needle from the other side. That makes a little bit of a bigger loop, and I strongly recommend that version. If it's pulling on your edge stitch a little bit, that's not a big deal. We don't worry about that. So to do that again, we go to our first purl row, and you can either bring it around the needle like that and purl, which gives you a very short yarn over because it's being pulled by 2 different stitches. Or what we can do is bring it over the top of the needle to the back side and then start purling. So that's the one that I recommend because it gives you a little more slack there. And that's actually really important for keeping your edge stitches loose. So that is a wonderful question. So then we get all the way to the other end of the row. Like seriously, a really good question. Because it's something that one always has to stop and think about. Oh, look at that, you rascally stitch popping off my needle. So now we're at the last stitch and we have to do a yarn over again. So again, what I would do is bring the yarn over the top of the needle and pull it in between them and around, so that you again have a nice loose yarn over. So the purpose of this is both an increase, but it also provides some slack for your edge stitches, because if the edge stitches are pulled really tight on this shawl, then you'll find that it doesn't want to have a proper angle on it, and it's not going to block as nicely. So that actually brings us to the next thing I was going to show you, which is if you're a really tight knitter, how do we get those edge stitches to be a little bit looser? So excellent question there. So I am now going to switch swatches because I have a teeny weeny beeny little shawl started here. And we're going to do a little bit of demonstration on exactly those things. So this teeny weeny bitty little shawl here is in a nice pink yarn. And the last stitch on this row was purled. So what we are going to do is to slip it with yarn and back. And then we have, what am I doing on my increases here? You'd think that as the designer you'd remember, but I always want to double check. Yes, so this row uses a knit front and back. So a knit front and back is knit into the front of the stitch, knit into the back of the stitch. Then we get ourselves knitting all the way to, and the reason why I have to do this row is I'm going to just do a refresher on our knit, make one right, come in from the back. Needle has to point to the right to get into that loop to keep it twisted. Slip our stitch marker. Notice, by the way, I've used different colored bulb pins here, stitch markers, whatever you want to use. I tend to use a different color on the right side and the wrong side, because if you're doing one of those rows where you might end up, say, knitting on both sides, it can suddenly be a little bit brain busting to know which side is the which. And so I'll use purple for the right side and green for the wrong side, left side, right side, whatever you want to call them, just so that it gives me a little reminder of where I am. Anyway, we're going to get all the way to the end, and we are going to do a knit front and back. Now you'll notice that this is in a yarn over, and sometimes people will do knit one, purl one into a yarn over to get 2 stitches. This is a knit front and back into that yarn over. Now the yarn over gives me all this nice slack in this edge stitch. So when I knit it, it gets nice and big. If you're a tight knitter and they are not big enough, then what you're going to do, so we're now on the wrong side, and this is where we make the purl stitch. You can always wrap it around twice, but if you go this way, that's not going to work so well for you in terms of being placed where you need to be. So wrap it around twice when you do your yarn over. Instead of wrapping once, wrap twice. Go ahead and finish your row, and I'll show you what that's going to be like on the other side. So wrapping twice gives you extra slack, and we're not going to do anything different with that when we go to work our knit front and back, except we'll drop one of the 2 wraps around the needle. So it's what's called a double yarn over. If you're knitting a shawl that has a slip stitch edge and there's no yarn overs on the edge and you're finding it's really tight, you can actually just put a yarn over in and then drop it on the next row, and that again gives you slack for that edge stitch. So that's a nifty little trick too that works really well, especially those sort of asymmetric rhombus shaped shawls. They can be very tight edged sometimes, and that can be a real problem. Okay, we've come to our last stitch. So again, to get this to be looser, I will wrap around the needle twice when I make my yarn over. Now, here I am ready to do my proper stuff, to do my edge stitch, and I have 2 wraps with that yarn over. Drop one of them, and then do your knit front and back. And that's going to give lots of extra slack on the edge there, which will give you a larger loop on the edge. So if you're having trouble with your edge stitches being really tight, that is a nifty little trick that will loosen them up. And you can do that whether there's a yarn over on the edge of the shawl or not. You just put it in on the previous row, drop it on the next one. And Bob's your uncle in terms of having that little bit more looseness. For some of us, it does not matter how big the needles are, we will still have certain elements that go quite tight for us. I used to be quite a tight knitter, and as I get older and my hands get, shall we say, more mature, I'm not as tight a knitter as I used to be, which is handy. But these are tricks that I picked up along the way when I was a much tighter knitter. Okay, now we're coming to that double yarn over, drop one of the loops, and then do your knit front and back just like normal. And now, when we do our edge stitch, see how I have more slack in there. So, great question. Really glad that you asked it. And that gives you a way of doing the yarn overs, so you now know the direction. And it gives you an opportunity to make those edge stitches looser. So this one here that has the yarn over giving you some slack is longer than the other ones. And the further I go with the shawl, the more you'd notice that you had more. So when we look at the edge of the shawl here, this is the edge that needs to have enough slack to be able to lie straight. So if your rows are not able to be nice and horizontal, then it'll skew the shape of the shawl. If you're having trouble getting those stitches big enough, then that's your little trick that you're going to use. Do a double yarn over and drop one of the loops out of the yarn over. That'll help a lot with that. Now,
Caroline,
yes,
can I ask a question?
sure.
So you could use that trick if you were doing a shawl that, say, had a knit front and back as the second stitch?
Absolutely. So what I would do then is that I would put a yarn over at the edge at the last stitch, and when I started the next row, I'd drop it and just leave it there.
On the right side or the wrong side?
You can do it on either side. So I'm on the wrong side here, which is a little bit awkward because technically this shape already has one. But what I would do is I would put a yarn over in.
Oops, you need to center.
Yeah, I would put a yarn over in. That's
Yeah.
why I was looking at you. It's all your fault. Knit as normal, but put a yarn over at this edge and a yarn over at this edge. And then when I go to work the right side row, work the stitch that I'm supposed to normally, whether it's a slip or whatever, drop the yarn over, work the next stitch as normal.
Wow.
So
Okay.
what the yarn over will do is give you that little bit of ease on the edge of the shawl so that it stretches properly. So this is one that you can use with any shape of shawl, whether there's a yarn over there or not. And a lot of shawls will not have a yarn over there. Doing a yarn over on an edge as an increase is actually less common than one might think. It's done on this particular shawl literally to get you some slack on there, because I could have done a knit front and back on both sides, but I did one with a yarn over and then knit into it because that gave more ease for the stitch. But like I say, for some of us, it's not enough, and that's a little trick you can use. And it's definitely a trick that you can use to put into any shawl at all. So it's a nice way of getting some slack on that edge. And you can see that the shape is starting to form here with our make one right and left along our spines.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I can visualize doing that, and on the first end that I'm coming back through, dropping that second loop,
Mhm.
and then getting to the other end and not dropping it. And then
So
3 or
that's the
4
one
rows
thing.
later going, oops.
Yeah, that's the one thing that you have to watch for, is if you're going to do that, you've got to remember to drop them. So what I tend to do is I'll alternate. So I've come to the end of this row here. I'll throw my yarn over in, do the last stitch, turn, do the thing I have to do at the beginning of the shawl, whether it's knit it or slip it, drop that loop, come to the end, put my yarn over in, do the last stitch. So you can either do it on both sides of one row or do it at the end every time.
Every time.
That
That's
might be
probably a
easier to
better idea
remember
because I
too.
can visualize forgetting that.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I've done. I remember on one shawl I was doing that. Actually, it was an Andrea Mowry shawl, and Birds of a Feather. Why we needed to know the name, no one knows, but I did that and I forgot about it. And I was like, wait a minute, why do I have a sort of a little increase here? Ah, okay, forgot to drop the yarn over it. And you can actually rip them back. You can just let them drop, but it's a little bit more noticeable. So that is a way of doing it. Just do it at the end of the row each time, right side and wrong side at the end. But it is a nice little trick that does get you that extra bit of slack in there, because you can see now on this one here, I've got more room to move because of that little trick. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to show you today is working the blossom buds. So the blossom buds, and I love it, okay, we're looking for an end. Here's an end. Wow. There's all sorts of crazy yarn things happening here. So the blossom buds, this is a thing designers will do, is they'll take a stitch and they'll be like, in the stitch dictionary or wherever they got it, it'll be named a blah, a whatever. And then they will name it a thing. And later on, you'll be like, well, that's not that. So the stitch that I have named Blossom Bud is actually also known by another name, which is Star Stitch. And I'm highly amused because I'm knitting a Stephen West shawl at the moment, and he calls it Daisy Stitch. All it is a stitch that gives you a gathered group of stitches, and they're very pretty. So they'll give you a shape. And to me, they look very much like buds about to open. So that's why I use them in this shawl. They're not difficult to work, but if you've never done them before, they can be a little bit confusing, and that's why I just wanted to show you. So this is a swatch, and we're going to work the second row of this, because these ones are all patterned on the second row. So just getting a little ways in here, past my little garter border. So now the Blossom Bud stitch, let's look at where that is in the pattern. You'll start doing that on page 5. And the first row, all you're doing is knitting the row with your regular increases. It's the second row where we are going to come along and start doing our blossom buds. So you would do the border of your shawl as normal. You're slipping the first stitch, doing a yarn over. Then what you're going to do is purl 1. Okay, yay, we have purled the first stitch. Then you're going to purl 3 together, but you're going to leave them on the needle. So you're going to pull the loop through, hold this 3 stitches on the left-hand needle, don't let them drop off. And then you're going to do a yarn over, and then you're going to purl them again. And this time you're going to let them drop off. So that what you've done is created 3 stitches on the needle, but one of them is a yarn over in between 2 purls into the same stitches. So that is a little bit anti-intuitive for some of us, but I'm going to demonstrate by continuing along the row. Each one is separated by a purl 1. So purl 1, and then we're going to put the needle into 3 stitches at a time, purl, leave the stitch on the left-hand needle, do a yarn over, and then purl those 3 again. Whoops. Now, that is actually something that is one of the other tips that I was going to give you, is that for this, having a nice long pointed needle makes it much, much easier to work those stitches, because you've got 3 stitches on the needle that will have a loop of yarn already worked through them, which tightens them up a bit. And the needle doesn't want to go through them very well. The other thing is if you put the needles crosswise, so like this, you'll find that your needle will be able to puncture them, as it were, a lot better. So there's a couple of things you can do. Use a very pointy needle, and then the other thing is play with the angle at which your needle is going into the stitches. So you see how if you do it in a cross, you can get that needle tip further into the stitches. So we're going to purl 3, holding them onto the left needle with your forefinger, purl them again. And I tend to give them a little tug just to loosen them up a tiny bit after you've worked them, because that last stitch might get a little snug for you. It's not going to hurt anything, but it's kind of not so nice on the next row when you've got one really tight stitch. So give it a little bit of slack, do your yarn over, purl 3 together again. So hopefully this is making sense for everybody. It's a little weird too. Ooh, split this one. It's a little weird because we're used to doing patterning things on right side rows, and this particular stitch does them on the wrong side. So just take the row slow and steady, and don't worry about rushing it. Give them a little tug before you let them go, and then everything is sliding along nicely. So you can see that what this is doing is giving you spaced out little clumps of stitches, and see how on the other side the stitches are wrapped around. So that gives you this nifty little pattern that, like I say, looks like little buds about to open. So do we have any questions about this? Not hearing any, which is great. So like I say, sometimes it's called star stitch, sometimes it's called daisy stitch. Some of us called it blossom bud stitch. It's a fun little stitch that gives you lots of decoration for not a lot of trouble, and it's only worked every second row. So in between, the stitches are normal. So I've come to the end of my swatch here, and then we'll just knit the next row so you can see them. And in the blossom bud rows here, we alternate 2 different colors. Now that brings up one other thing, which is carrying yarn up the side of your shawl. Don't break the yarn in between those rows. You can just carry the yarn up, and I'll show you how to do that. We'll get to the end of this, and then we'll carry up the green yarn. So the next row is just a nice straight knit, and you're just knitting these 3 stitches one at a time on this next row. So nothing fancy. They may look kind of bunchy when you're working the row of blossom bud stitches. Don't let that rattle you, because when you come to knit them, they'll all just kind of shake themselves out. If they don't, you want the yarn over stitch in the center, and you'll immediately notice if you cross over something, because it'll start looking a bit weird. I've done this stitch lots and lots and lots. There's actually a KAL that we did with Interweave a few years ago in the Ancient Gemstones shawl, and that one actually used star stitch as well. Very exciting watching somebody else knit, I'm sure. Okay, now we've got to the end of our row, and you can see your nifty little stars there, alias your blossoms. See how they look like flowers just about to open? Now for carrying the yarn, our last stitch was a knit stitch. So we have to slip with yarn in front, but we're going to move to the other yarn. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the yarn that you just finished with, put it to the back of the work, and then take the new yarn that you're moving to and bring it up underneath that one. So this technically crosses over. And then you're just going to go along and work with it. If you're worried about the tension, what you can do is just give a little tug so that you have a nice straight line of yarn along the edge of your shawl. That's going to tuck itself up nicely against the back of the shawl, and you will never see it later. So that's all that you need to do. So here on the next set of star stitches, they're actually offset from the previous one. So you just want to pay attention to how it's written and make sure that you do that offset. So when we get to the next set of these, we're going to actually do our edge stitches, and then we would purl 5 so that we get them offset. So they alternate into the middle. So carrying yarn up, nice and simple. If you have to slip with yarn in front, just take the old yarn to the back of the work in between the needles before you start with the new yarn. And that, like I say, will lie smoothly along the edge of your shawl. You'll never see it again. I don't want you to have to break off your dark yarn when you do the pink in the middle and then the dark again, because that means you've got that many more ends to weave in. And let's face it, none of us want to do that. So that concludes all of the little tips that I wanted to give you for the first part of the shawl. If anybody else has any questions, I'd love to hear them. If not, then that's great. I'm going to mention one other thing about the pattern here. So in the pattern, I have broken the charts into left sides and right sides. And the reason that we've done that is because this would be a very long chart, and then it gets really, really small. And personally, I find it very difficult to read teeny tiny, eeny beeny little chart. So what you'll do with the charts is you'll work the right side row, and then you'll go to the same row and you'll work the left side row. So right side, left side, they connect right up. You can also do something that I have been known to do, which is to print the page out and cut it in half and stick them together. And, that can sometimes be useful, depending on how your brain works and how you like to flow through. Now, when we get to the written instructions, I just wanted to mention that there is no reason to make you go to 2 different sections of writing and have to go and put those together. So the first row of the same chart here is the entire both sides, right and left, put together. So first it's the right side, and then we get to the center stitch, and then it's the left side. So it's all in one sentence, as it were. The charts are broken into 2. So I just wanted to point that out in case you're a person who likes to go back and forth between the 2 of them. So they're put together in the written. So if you're a person who prefers to knit off of the written instructions, you don't have another 5 pages of this and are trying to connect them together. So this was just something I did because sometimes I will go and I'll knit from either the written, or I might use the chart, or I might use both. So I just wanted you to be aware of what I did there in order to make this flow better for the people who were working from the written instructions. Alrighty, well, I think that brings us to the end of our Zoom. I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us, both today and for the knit along in general. And if you have any questions at all in between the Zoom sessions, feel free to contact us. You can just email me through Ancient Arts, send me a note through one of the social media platforms, and I would be absolutely delighted to help you out with it, because I know that there's interesting and eclectic things in any shawl pattern, and it is always nice. Let's just change this spotlight here. It's always nice to be able to get some help along the way. So I do wish you a wonderful afternoon and happy knitting in your festival garden.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.